While digging a well, the rancher uncovered a cellar and heard soft breathing. The crowbar hit wood at 11 feet. I remember that exactly. Not because I marked it on anything. I've never been a man who writes things down, but because it was 3 strokes past the point where I decided the ground had beaten me and I was going to quit. That's usually how things go. 3 strokes past quitting and you hit something. The sound was wrong, a dull thud where there should have been stone or packed clay. I set the crowbar against the wall of the hole and put my boot sole flat on the ground below me and felt it. A hollow beneath. Some give to it, not much, the way a floor feels when the joist under it has half rotted through. I went up out of the hole and pulled boards and opened the cellar. That was the autumn of my 47th year, and I had been alone on that land for going on 9 months. The man I'd bought the ranch from had said the well was there, marked it on a rough drawing, gave me a copy in his hand. What he'd given me was a dry hole 12 feet deep with a cedar post shoved in it and a decade of wind-blown grit at the bottom. I dug a new hole 30 yards east of it. Started late October when the ground was still workable. That first morning I could see my breath, but the digging warmed me soon enough, and I fell into the rhythm of it the way you fall into most hard work. You stop thinking and your body takes over, and the hours pass without you noticing them. I want to be straight with you about that time. I wasn't unhappy, not exactly. Unhappy is a word that implies you had something better before and lost it. I'd never had the thing that was missing, so it was more like a flatness. The way a high plateau looks from a distance, no low places but no peaks either, just flat going on. The ranch was mine. I'd worked for it, 12 years drifting from one outfit to the next, picking up wages and setting them aside and picking up wages again. I didn't drink. I didn't gamble. I had a name for being steady with horses and fair with men, but a little cold, and I never minded the reputation. Cold kept people at a distance, and distance kept things simple. I'd bought the place in February, moved in before the snow was off the ground, and by October I had 3 dozen head on decent grass, a roof that didn't leak badly, and the beginnings of a plan. I told myself the plan was enough. Most mornings I believed it. The cellar was 6 feet deep and maybe 10 by 12. Dirt walls, a heavy plank floor. Someone had sealed it from below with clay packed around the edges, which was why I hadn't noticed the give in the earth before. When I pulled the last board and the light fell in, I could smell it, damp and close, and the specific smell of a fire that's been out for many hours, like cold ash and the ghost of pine smoke mixed together. And then I heard her. Not a voice, a breath, the slow, uneven kind that comes with fever. I sat at the edge of the opening with my legs hanging down and I looked. My eyes adjusted. She was in the far corner on her side, wrapped in a horse blanket that might have been gray or brown, hard to say. Small. Still. I said something. I don't remember the words. She didn't answer. I went down. Here is what I knew within the first 10 minutes. She had a fever that had been working on her for a while. A cut on her left forearm gone bad in the way cuts go bad when they're not tended. And she'd been in that cellar for at least 2 days going by the water jug, nearly empty, and she'd started with a full one. I could see the rings. She was thin. Not just thin the way a woman gets when she's been hungry a week, but thin that comes from a long time of not enough. Her wrists, when I shifted the blanket to check the arm, were small as a boy's. She came to just enough to pull back when I touched her. That's how you know a person's been through something hard. It's not tears. It's the flinch that happens before thought. I said, "I'm not going to hurt you." She looked at me. Her eyes were dark and very clear. Fever sometimes does that, burns everything else off and leaves just the eyes. She said, in a voice that had almost no sound to it, "That's what the other one said." I didn't answer that. There was nothing to answer. I got her arm out of the blanket and looked at the cut. It had red lines running from it, thin as thread, going up toward the elbow. That's blood poisoning starting, and I knew it. I said, "I need to move you to the house. You can argue with me in an hour if you want." She didn't argue. Her name was Nora Vass. She told me that the second day when the fever came down enough for real words. She was a widow, her husband had been dead a year, a man named Vass who had a homestead claim 20 miles east, though she said it flat without grief, the way you say the name of a town you used to live in. The grief, I gathered, had been used up before he died. She'd been heading west with what she could carry. The men who found her on the road had taken her horse, her rifle, and most of her food, and when she'd gotten away from them, she said it that plain, when she'd gotten away, she'd found the cellar and gone down into it meaning to rest and wait them out. She'd been sick before she went in. I asked how many days. She said she didn't know, she'd lost count. She told me all of this from the bed in my spare room, the room I used for storage, which I'd cleared in a hurry, dragging flour sacks and a broken saddle, and 3 years of someone else's old tools into the hall. The bed was narrow and the mattress wanted replacing. She didn't mention either of those things. She lay on her side facing the window and talked in that careful way sick people talk, spacing the words to save strength. When she'd told me enough, she went quiet for a while. Then she said, "I'm sorry to be trouble." I was standing at the window. The glass was wavy, old glass, and the yard through it looked slightly bent. I said, "You're not trouble." She said, "I will be." I said, "Then you will be." And that was the end of that conversation. The first 2 weeks I barely slept. Not from worry, exactly, or at least I told myself it wasn't. The wound needed watching. Twice it looked like she was going to be lost. Once the second night when the fever spiked and I sat with her until almost morning with a wet cloth and a lamp turned low, and once at the end of the first week when the red lines didn't recede the way they should have. The second time I rode to Burden, which was the nearest town, 14 miles each way in cold that was getting serious, and I brought back a doctor named Haas who was old and smelled of pipe tobacco and knew his business. Haas looked at the arm, looked at her, and said to me, "You cleaned this out right." I said I'd done what I knew. He said, "That's more than most." He gave me something for the fever and something for the infection, and told me what to watch for and what to do. He charged me a fair price and left. She got better. Not fast. Nothing about those weeks was fast. But by the middle of the second week, she was sitting up and eating what I brought her. And by the third she was on her feet an hour at a time. I came in from the stock one morning and found her standing at the kitchen stove with my coffee pot in her hand looking at it, the way a person looks at a thing they know how to use and have missed. She made the coffee without asking. I sat down at the table and she poured 2 cups and sat across from me. The kitchen had a window that faced east and the early light came in sideways and lay along the table between us. She had her hands around the cup. She hadn't looked directly at me much until that morning. She did now. She said, "You don't talk very much." I said, "I know." She said, "Do you mind if I do?" I said, "No." And she did. Not constantly and not foolishly. She wasn't a woman given to foolish talk, but carefully the way she did most things, choosing what she said. She asked me about the ranch, how the ground laid, what I'd planted and where, what I was planning for the spring. Real questions, the kind a person asks when they actually want to know. I found myself answering in more words than I was used to using. The sound of my own voice in a room talking to someone felt odd, like finding a muscle you hadn't used in a long time. December came, she stayed. I hadn't asked her to. She hadn't told me she was staying. It happened the way weather happens, not a decision, just a thing that was true when you looked up. She took over the kitchen, which I didn't object to. She cleaned the place in a way I hadn't, getting into corners I'd stopped noticing. She had opinions about where things should go, and I found that I didn't mind having someone in the house with opinions. One afternoon, I was working on a section of fence line that had come down in the wind, maybe a quarter-mile from the house. Cold day, hard work, the kind of work where you stop thinking about everything but what's in front of you. When I came back in at dusk, she had supper on. Not the plain things I'd been eating alone, real food, things that took time. She'd used herbs from somewhere, dried ones she'd had in her pack, I found out later, things she'd carried all that way. I sat down and ate, and I didn't say much because I didn't have the words for what I was trying not to feel. It had been a very long time since anyone had done something for me just to do it. She watched me once across the table. She said, "It's not charity." I looked up. She said, "I can see you thinking it's charity. It isn't. You pulled me out of a hole in the ground. We're even, and after we're even it's just people doing for each other." I said, "I didn't do it to be owed anything." She said, "I know that. That's exactly what I'm saying." I didn't understand it entirely then. I thought about it for a long time after. January was brutal that year. The kind of cold that settles in and won't lift, the kind where the horses stand together in the far corner of the pen, and you can hear the wood of the barn contracting at night. I was out every day regardless. The work doesn't stop because of cold. You check the stock, break the ice in the water troughs, bring feed, make sure everything that needs shelter has it. I came in each night with my hands half frozen and my face burned by the wind. She'd leave a pot on the stove. Not always something elaborate, sometimes just beans, sometimes whatever there was, but hot, always hot. I want to tell you about a particular night in that January, because I think it's the night I have to tell, even though it's the one I've turned over more than any other. It was the coldest week of the year, and I'd been out longer than usual because a calf had gotten through a gap in the fence line, and I'd spent 2 hours finding it in the dark with a lantern that kept wanting to blow out. I came in late. She was at the table with a lamp mending. She looked up at me and then stood without saying anything and came and took my hat and scarf and coat and hung them, and then she took my hands, both of them, in both of hers, and held them under her arms at the sides of her body to warm them. Just that. She stood there and held my hands against the warmth of her until I could feel them again. I didn't move. I was afraid if I moved she'd stop. She didn't look at me. She was looking somewhere past my shoulder. After a while she said, quietly, "Your hands are going to crack open if you keep coming in like this." I said, "I know." She said, "I'll make a salve." I said, "All right." She let go of my hands and went back to the table and the mending, and I stood there in the middle of my kitchen, and something in me, something that had been sealed for a very long time, opened about an inch. February was when she told me about her life before. Not all at once. In pieces, over different evenings, the way real things come out, not as a story but as a pile of separate facts that take a shape slowly. She'd grown up in Ohio, one of 6 children, her father a school teacher. She'd learned to read early and read everything she could find, and this set her apart in ways she hadn't wanted to be set apart at 12 and 13, but had come to value later. She'd married Vass at 22 because she'd thought he was going somewhere and she'd wanted to go somewhere too. He wasn't cruel, she said this plainly, not in his defense but as a fact, just small. Small in his thinking, small in what he wanted, willing to fail at everything quietly and call it God's will. She said, "I don't mean to speak badly of him." I said, "You're not. You're just describing what happened." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I'd forgotten what that was like." I said, "What?" She said, "Someone just listening. Without telling me, I'm wrong to feel it." I didn't know what to do with that. I looked at the fire. After a while I said, "You're not wrong to feel it." She looked at me for a long time. In a way she'd been looking at me differently since January, since the night with the hands, and I'd been pretending not to notice because noticing felt like a thing that could get away from you. She said, "You're a careful man." I said, "I've been told I'm a cold one." She said, "You're not cold, you're careful. There's a difference and someone should have told you that before now." I didn't answer. She said, "Is it because someone hurt you, or because you were always that way?" I said, "Both, I suppose." She nodded, like that was a real answer, like that was enough. March thaw came late, the way it sometimes does, And when it came hard and fast, 3 days of warm wind that turned the yard to mud and sent the creek up over its banks. I was moving stock to higher ground 2 days running, working from before light until after dark. She did the kitchen work and the house, and she also, I came home the second evening to find, had managed the chickens, which I'd completely forgotten about in the rush, and repaired a section of the small fence near the house that the mud had undercut. I stood at the fence in the last gray light looking at the repair. She'd done it right, posts seated properly, wire tight. I went in and she was at the stove and I said, "You fixed the fence." She said it needed doing. I said, "That's harder work than it looks." She turned and looked at me over her shoulder. There was something in her face, not pride exactly, but something adjacent to it. She said, "I know hard work." I said, "I can see that." She turned back to the stove. I stood there. There are moments in your life where you can feel yourself standing at the edge of a thing, where you know if you take one step you're going to be somewhere you've never been and can't come back from. I had been standing at that edge for a while by then. I'd been pretending I couldn't see it. I said, "Nora." She said, "I know." I said, "I don't have much to offer." She put the spoon down and turned all the way around. She looked at me straight, the way she'd looked at me when she was sick in that cellar and everything was burned away, and there was only the truth of a person. She said, "You dug a hole in the ground for months in the cold because you wanted to build something. You carried a sick woman you'd never met up out of the earth and sat up nights when you didn't have to. You work from before light and you're fair and you're steady and you don't complain about any of it." She stopped. Then she said, "That's not nothing. You've been told all your life it's nothing. I think it isn't." I felt the words land somewhere. I felt them land the way a thing lands when you've been waiting for it, without knowing you were waiting. She said, "I'm not asking for promises. I'm just telling you what I see." I crossed the kitchen, that's all. I crossed the kitchen and she didn't back away. We married in May at the courthouse in Burden. Haas the doctor was there, and a cattleman named Prout I'd done business with and his wife, who cried the way some women do at weddings, and the judge who was a quiet, decent man and kept the whole thing brief. Nora wore a blue dress she'd sewn herself over the winter. Her hair was up, and there were a few strands of it loose at her neck, and the light outside the courthouse was the particular light of a May morning in that part of the country, thin and gold, and going on forever. She looked at me when the judge finished speaking, and I looked at her, and she put her hand in mine, and the weight of her hand there, small, strong, a hand that had worked and knew it, was something I have thought about many times since. Prout shook my hand. His wife hugged Nora. Haas shook my hand and said, "You did a good thing taking care of her when she was sick." He meant it as a kindness. Nora heard it. She said, "Very pleasant, very even. He took care of me and I took care of him." A pause. "We're pretty well matched that way." Haas looked surprised. Nora just smiled. I understood then what she'd meant in the kitchen that March evening about people doing for each other. She'd meant it as a principle, not a transaction. I thought I was the one who had rescued her from that cellar. I had it exactly backward. We finished the well in June. The two of us dug the last 6 feet together. I did the work. She sent the bucket up and down on the windlass, and when we hit water at 22 feet she let out a sound I don't have a word for, somewhere between a laugh and a cry, and leaned over the edge of the hole and said, "There it is." I looked up at her. She was backlit by the noon sun, her face in shadow, just the outline of her, the set of her shoulders, the dark fall of her hair out of its pins from the work, the brightness of the sky behind her. I said, "There it is." She pulled me up. We stood at the top together with the new bucket in the new well and the ranch going out around us in every direction, the grass coming in, the cattle moving slow in the far distance, the sky so wide you had to stop looking eventually or it would undo you. She had her hand in the crook of my arm, easy, like it had always been there. Maybe it had. Maybe it was there before she was, waiting. I had spent 12 years alone drifting and 9 months alone on that land, and I hadn't known, exactly, what I was building toward. I'd thought it was a well. I thought it was cattle on good grass. I thought it was a plan. She leaned against me. The afternoon was warm. A hawk was working the thermals a long way off, turning slow circles. I didn't say any of that. You don't say things like that out loud, not when they're true and the person you'd say them to is already beside you. That's the whole of it. That's what there is to tell.